Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the Dream Unfinished YouTube show. So, I want to make an introduction today to somebody new to TDU's YouTube show, but not new to TDU. We're so happy to be with wonderful vocalist and administrator Jasmine Wilson. Thank you, Jasmine, for being here and joining us. And my name is Sarah Overton. I'm the production manager for The Dream Unfinished. We're going to be talking a little bit about the history of movements and movements of solidarity, especially in this country. So, thinking a little bit about what's going on with the Black Lives Matter movement and just kind of how all of these things mesh and support and shows of support for Asian American communities. We're in our Instruments for Change segment. We're going to be talking about organizations that support Asian Americans, specifically in New York City. Kicking us off for our Instruments for Change segment, Jasmine, do you want to just tell us a little bit about maybe kind of how this episode came to be as you and I were talking in our conversation, and we can get in a little bit to these Instruments for Change.
For sure, for sure. Well, first, thank you again for having me this evening. Love being able to do things with TDU. And this episode came about because you and I were just chatting about what it's like to make music right now and thinking about what is the role that music has in movements, which of course is what TDU is all about. And so much of what I do beyond classical music is really informed and rooted in improvisation. And I think that when people initially receive improvisation, they think that it's just random stuff happening in the moment. And to a degree, that's true. But that's happening because behind that, before all of that, there's been so much conscious effort put into learning your craft, learning about different sounds, putting yourself in different environments, and learning how to really listen and to respond in the moment. And so much of those skills translate into being a part of a movement where you're trying to create progressive change and to have inclusive change. You are practicing these skills of listening, you're practicing these skills of responding in the moment because it's impossible to know exactly what's going to happen. But the more that you do it, the more that you're able to also build community around it, there's something that can be really powerful that can come out of whatever you're doing. So whether it's in music and you're using your instrument or you're using your voice or and to create music, but also if you're using your body, you're using your voice and whatever tools are available to you to be that instrument of change, there is that interweaving that happens in building movements and executing movements and moving through them. So that's how we got here. At least that's what I think.
I think so too. Yeah, and it was such an interesting conversation because as we were just thinking about how we can be supportive of movements right now. We talked a lot about this word solidarity, and I know we'll get a little bit into improv and the musical side of it later. But when we think about solidarity, this picture is really especially telling. I'm going to share my screen very quickly. This is from the Asian American Writers Workshop. And this is high school students in Oakland at a Black Panther Party funeral rally for Bobby Hutton from 1969. And it got me thinking about, how everyone showed support to the Black community throughout the Black Lives Matter movements and protests, peaceful protests of last summer. And then also, throughout what's going on right now with violence against the Asian American community, how we show solidarity as groups. And so let's talk a little bit about, the unfortunate violence against the Asian American community. And unfortunately, it is it's a real thoroughfare, a through line through United States history. We think about the Japanese internment camps, And especially, Tadetaka Uno, who was a pianist, a rising jazz pianist last fall, who was brutally attacked on the New York City subway. And it eventually ended up that he left back to Japan after those attacks.
Mhm.
And we're seeing a resurgence of this sort of othering in societies, and seeing people as the other. And it's so disheartening, but I know that there are some organizations that are doing some really great work around this. Specifically in New York, Asian Americans for Equality, I'm going to share my screen again, does some really wonderful work in terms of housing and housing disparities for Asian Americans. I think they have created something like 1,000 homes
Wow.
that are at a fair price for Asian American communities. 20,000 people access AAFE services annually, $416,000 in mortgages facilitated for first-time home buyers. This is just, absolutely wonderful work.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure, too, that when we talk about Asian Americans in New York and in the United States at large, that just like with the Black Lives Matter movement, this is not a monolithic community at all
Absolutely.
by any means. There's very uh, so many differences between the Asian American Pacific Islander community to Japanese American community to the Chinese American community, Korean American community, onwards and onwards. So it's just wonderful to see that these organizations are addressing these disparities among the Asian American diaspora. Um,
And also just to
yeah,
jump in briefly, Sarah, is
please.
that these organizations have been in existence, noticing, recognizing, and responding to the needs of the people that they represent and that they serve. And I want to highlight that because I feel like so often it takes horrendous tragedies for some of these organizations to be noticed or to be realized. Or it can also happen that there's someone who says, well, XYZ should be happening or they should be doing this. And there's that language of othering that starts to come in. And I think it's important to pause for a moment and instead of saying they should or XYZ should be doing this, think about what is already happening and what can I do? What can we do to amplify that work, to further that work? And maybe even a deeper question is that what is the best way for me to do that? As a Black woman, clearly I don't belong to the Asian American community. However, there are ways that I can be supportive, that I can um, lend my talents, whether that is even in conversations that I have with people that I know, or to be someone who causes that pause. Like, wait a second, why are you saying they? Why why do you assume that this is something new? As you mentioned, Sarah, at the very beginning of this conversation, there's a very unfortunate history of violence against the Asian American community and against Asian Americans, period. And I think part of that violence is beyond, it goes a little deeper than the the brutalities that we see and that we hear about that's really complicated. There's also a history of erasure, this history of silencing, and that is violent because it makes it seem as if this is new and it's 100% not. I don't know about you, but I enjoyed taking history classes when I was in high school. That was my favorite class. I loved APUS history, and I think that there was a whole paragraph that talked about Japanese internment. And that's not okay. That's not right. So that means in my present life as a grown adult that I have a responsibility to also fill in the gaps and to be curious and to wonder what else is out there. And that's another aspect I want to emphasize or to highlight when we talk about all of these amazing organizations that are doing really, really important work. Why is it that there's this really, really important work? What is the history behind the disparities that exists. Of course, every community has their own nuances, and that's beautiful. That's what makes this country what it is, right?
Mhm.
However, what happens when we live in a society that pretends, and oh, it pretends that there isn't really problematic things that get tolerated or that get hushed, and
Mhm.
then pretend as if we're surprised? Unfortunately, as painful as it is, it's not. I wish it were more surprising. I wish it were more surprising, and um, I'm very, very grateful that some of these organizations do exist and that it's possible for us um, to educate ourselves and to hopefully connect on a deeper level with our own compassion and empathy so that we can see that um, we're neighbors, you know, we're sharing this earth with each other, and that there's something more for us to learn from one another rather than to fear and eventually hate one another.
Mhm. Uh, Jasmine, what you said is so powerful, and I want to go back on this point about erasure, because I know that as a Black woman, I really experienced a lot of this. Going, just thinking about the Black Lives Matter protests as well. I needed a lot of I and people that I cared for were really just inundated with all of this information of the things that we missed and our history again, and these things that were coming up, and viewing a lot of this violence being talked to about it, being talked around it,
Mm,
talking around it. And I want to highlight a resource here, the Asian Mental Health Collective,
yeah.
because what's was so important, what became so important, to me and folks in my community, especially, was our mental health. Kind of as we dealt with a lot of these feelings that we were having, realizing how much erasure was going on, and just kind of trying to comfort and be there for one another. So the Asian Mental Health Collective is another organization, like you said, has been around, for a very long time, and is doing making great strides and just talking around Asian mental health, how we talk to each other, how Asian communities, speak about themselves, the value of lived experiences,
Mhm.
documenting depression. These are just wonderful resources for folks to really be aware of, that they can speak with one another about this, that we can speak to each other about this. And just knowing that there are simultaneous health crises going on right now in a lot of communities. So, the other resources that I really want to take some time just to point out, the Asian American Bar Association and the Asian American Legal Defense Fund are doing a lot of wonderful work in hate and discrimination cases across the country. And then, as always, the Asian Pacific COVID-19 Relief Fund, which is an organization that is relatively new, that's making a lot of impact in just Asian Pacific Islander communities, Asian American Pacific Islander communities. So it's great to have these things around, and we'll be sure to drop all of these links after we're finished with our conversation here. But again, like you said, this idea of solidarity and how we can recognize one another as neighbors and decenter this I in the conversation, this self in the conversation. It reminds me of Malcolm X and Yuri Kochiyama.
Right. Yeah.
And this was such a wonderful story just to kind of come across in doing this research. Yuri Kochiyama is an activist, excuse me, in the 60s, who shook Malcolm X's hand, and Malcolm X said, "What for?" And
This is such a cute story.
you know, and And like you said, it's totally decentering that I, and she knew immediately. She said to congratulate you for giving direction to your people. It wasn't thank you for inspiring me or thank you for mobilizing me. There was nothing to do with her. It was I want to celebrate you, and I want to support you and be a part of what you're doing.
I
Um,
think that I think that's one of the beautiful things too of when you are deeply rooted in what you care about most. And I think that it's possible to inspire people by whatever is your talent or whatever is your gift, using it in the way that is most authentic to who you are. Because somebody else might see it and say, wow, if they can do that, then maybe I can do it for myself and for whoever else I represent or whoever else I work with. And I think that that moment is something that is so special because, like you said, Sarah, it wasn't you inspire me because of you, but more of I so respect and I admire what you're doing and how you are uplifting people who don't necessarily belong to my community. That's really powerful. I love that.
Yeah, I'm curious to hear more, just of your reaction to reading about Yuri Kochiyama and Malcolm X, because this was just it was such a fascinating meeting, such a fascinating partnership, two people and two communities coming together.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's just such a ah, I think that these are the kinds of stories I would love to see more of, to be honest. Because when I think of Malcolm X, I'm thinking of, the guy with the glasses and standing up and by any means necessary. Um, and there's so many people that he touched and so many people that um, he worked with. And so I think that this particular story and this particular relationship between Yuri Kochiyama and himself um, highlights how there can be two movements running in parallel to one another and also intersecting or interweaving with one another. And I just think that she was just an amazing person because didn't she describe herself as feeling more shy, more reserved, and yet was doing some radical things? I mean, this activism that really deepened and maybe in some ways blossomed. Um, I, 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 I find it so just so special, and I think it's unique, but because it was special, and I think because it was also authentic, it also brought this attention to her as being a threat. And I think that when you are trying to fight for justice for your own community, you also are bringing attention towards yourself and challenging the status quo. And she challenged the status quo. Yuri Kochiyama challenged the status quo. And so I really like how this relationship, I think, inspired each other in some ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, just the stories that her daughter shared in this article. And we're talking about an NPR article,
Hmm.
by the way. It's called Not Just the Black Thing, an Asian Americans Bond with Malcolm X, that came out in August of 2013. And her daughter tells the story. Like you said, Yuri Kochiyama herself was more of an introverted person, just took her time to be reserved and then come out and advocate and her daughter just was talking about dinner plates being shared with articles and there were people that were just coming in and out of the house all of the time, and she really became this movement, she invested herself in it, in civil rights,
So much so that the FBI had files on her,
yes.
calling her a ringleader of black nationalists and a red Chinese agent, which in so many ways is problematic.
Oh, absolutely. But
So,
yeah, she was just a real embodiment of this. And it's,
yeah.
it's a wonderful example. And especially with, the Confucius Plaza protests in Manhattan, and the amount of Black civil rights leaders that came out to support the Asian American community in those protests. This type of um, congruent movement, intersectionality, solidarity has been going on for a really long time, and it's exciting to see. Jasmine, thank you so much
Thank you
for
again.
joining us today. Thank you everyone for being here. Please drop a comment if you enjoyed today's show. Be sure to hit that subscribe button, hit that like button, and we'll send out all of those other resources and links as well so that folks can be their own instruments for change in their communities. So thanks again for tuning in. Please come back as next week. We'll be exploring activism within and without music, and we'll be happy to see you wherever TDU goes. All right. Thanks everyone again.